Hey guys, so today I'm going to be showing you how to set up an Express project with TypeScript. For those of you who don't know, TypeScript is JavaScript, but strongly typed. So it's a variant of JavaScript. TypeScript will typically look somewhat similar to something that you would find in a language like Java that's strongly typed as well. The strong typing allows for stronger editor checks, like in this example where we have the fields of the user object clearly defined, such that if we were to reference the wrong field, it would give us an error message, which allows us to strengthen the robustness of the IntelliSense of our IDE. The website also showcases how the autocomplete features in your IDE will also be more robust thanks to TypeScript, since it knows what functions are available for use for any given object. TypeScript also allows us to have interfaces such that we can extend an interface using multiple different object types. There are also various other advantages to using TypeScript as well, such as the ability to support JSX files. TypeScript is getting pretty popular these days, so let's take a look and see how we can set up an Express project with TypeScript. So to get started here, we have to navigate to the directory where we want to create our project, and let's go ahead and run npx express generator, and the name of our project which is going to be TypeScript demo. This will use npx to call the Express generator library to generate an Express project for us. So this will just give us some boilerplate code such that we can execute and run our Express server right off the bat. If npx is not working for you, make sure that you have Node installed on your system. Now that we've set up our TypeScript demo directory, let's go ahead and open up VS Code. And here we can see the project explorer for this boilerplate Express application. All right, so to get us started off with TypeScript, I'm just going to go ahead and open up a terminal window here. Now I'm going to install some dependencies. So we're going to start off by installing TypeScript, tsnode, and tsnode dev. These are three dependencies that we're going to need for our TypeScript application. So any TypeScript project is going to require the TypeScript dependency. tsnode is a library that will allow us to execute TypeScript files, similar to how we execute JavaScript files, without having to go through the extra step of compiling the TypeScript files into vanilla JavaScript. And then lastly, tsnode dev is simply a kind of a helper library that will allow us to have hot swapping, where whenever we make a change to our TypeScript application, it will go ahead and refresh the server for us so that we don't have to do that manually. Once the install is done here, I can go ahead and run npm install, and this will install the rest of the dependencies that came with this boilerplate Express application. And then I can go ahead and run npm start. And this will run our Express server on port 3000. If I navigate over to localhost 3000, you can see that the Express server is working. This is just to check to make sure that everything's working right out of the box. All right, so let's go ahead and convert this into a TypeScript application. So the first step we need to do is create a tsconfig file. So tsconfig.json. Now I'm going to go ahead and paste the configs from a different project just to save time. So you'll see a variety of different configs here. I'm going to go more into detail about these a bit later. The next thing we need to do is run one more npm add for tsconfig/node18. And what this will do is it will allow us to import the base tsconfig file that we're building off for our own tsconfig. And what this will allow us to do is it will allow us to build off of this base tsconfig file with a tsconfig file of our own. So we're actually extending a tsconfig file that's already pre-configured for us. If we were to navigate over to this GitHub repo for the tsconfig base files, you'll find that this is the file that we're extending here. So these are kind of the default options for our tsconfig file. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to make a few changes in the project structure here. I'm going to go ahead and create a folder called source. I'm going to move app.js into source. I'm going to navigate over to bin. I'm going to take this www file here, and I'm going to rename it to index.js. And I'm also going to move this to source. And then lastly, I'm going to go ahead and take the routes folder and move the entire folder into source as well. All right, so I'm going to navigate over to index.js here. I'm just going to adjust the references here. So the reference to app is now in the same directory as index.js. So I just have to remove one of the dots here. And then in app.js, I'm going to have to take the views folder and make sure it references the directory that's above the current directory. And then similarly to public. And then lastly, I'm going to navigate to package.json. And I'm going to change the start command here to tsnode dev source/index.js. And now if you go ahead and navigate over to localhost 3000, you'll see that our server is working just fine. But of course, this isn't quite yet a TypeScript project. We're just using vanilla JavaScript files to set up our Express server just like before. So let's go ahead and convert some of these files into TypeScript files so that we can fully take advantage of the TypeScript capabilities. So I'm going to navigate over to tsconfig.json here, and I'm just going to briefly explain what some of the configs are doing here. So in particular, the include and exclude config options here are telling the TypeScript compiler where our source code is located. So the include config here is telling the compiler that the source code for the application will be found in the source folder. And similarly, the exclude config is telling the compiler what JavaScript files to not include in the compilation of the project. So of course, we don't want to include the node modules and similarly, the build folder will contain the compiled JavaScript files from our source code. So we don't want to include those in the compilation either. We have to specify a build folder because for production builds, typically the TypeScript is compiled and converted into vanilla JavaScript, and then that later is executed by Node. So that's why we need to specify a build folder here. And that's what this outdir config is doing. This allow.js config is simply telling the TypeScript project that we're allowing for vanilla JavaScript files. And the reason for this is that we're able to use this config to have the boilerplate Express code work right out of the box. So we don't have to convert it into a TypeScript file first. And then we'll shortly see what the deal is with the no implicit any config. So let's start running some TypeScript code. So let's go ahead and navigate to routes/index.js. And I want to convert this into a TypeScript file. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to convert the file extension from JS to TS. And immediately you're going to start seeing some syntax errors here. So the IDE is actually complaining that rec, res, and next implicitly have an any type. So in TypeScript, you have to explicitly define the types for the various variables that are in use. So in this case, we have not imported the type definitions from Express. So the code does not actually know what types that these variables have. And that's what the no implicit any config is actually doing. Since we're setting this to true here, it will make sure that any variables we have declared in the code have some sort of type attached to them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to convert the common JS syntax here into ECMAScript. And all I had to do here was change the require statement into an import statement. And I also changed the module.export statement into an export default statement. So now we're abiding by the ECMAScript syntax. Next, you'll see a red underline under the Express import. And this is because we haven't imported the TypeScript typing for our Express imports. So we're going to go ahead and do that by going down here. We're going to close the Express server that we have running. And then we're going to run npm add type/express. And this will add the TypeScript type definitions for the Express import. And this is a common thing that you'll see. A lot of these libraries that we're going to be importing as dependencies will actually need to have their types imported as well so that we can have context as to what the typing is for the various fields and variables that are imported as part of these dependencies. So now that that's done, you'll see that the red underlines are gone. And now we have the explicit typing for everything related to Express here. In particular, if I was to hover over the rec variable here, you'll see that it has a variable type of request, res has a variable type of response, and next is correctly detected to be a next function. So we can see our typing is actually working here. So let's go ahead and write some code here so we can check out the capabilities of TypeScript. I'm going to go ahead and write a simple function here, function times 5. It's going to take in an integer value, and there you have it. So you'll notice that this isn't quite adhering to TypeScript standards. So for one, you see a red underline under the num parameter, and the reason for this is we're implicitly setting it to a data type of any. And we previously set in our tsconfig to not allow that. We need to explicitly define a type for our parameter. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add the type definition. So TypeScript allows you to do this by simply adding a colon and then the data type immediately afterward. So this is how we define the data type of the parameter. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is have this function return the number times 5. So now that we have a return statement, we can clearly see that the return type for this function is an integer. So we actually want to add the type definition for this function. And we can do this by similarly just adding a colon here and then setting the data type for the return statement. So now we have a TypeScript function that takes in a number parameter and returns a number as a result. So let's go ahead and change this router here. I'm going to change this code to take in a user ID from the query parameters of our HTTP request. I'm going to take in that parameter and plug it into the times5 function. I'm going to save it to a variable called num. And then I'm going to have the endpoint return the result as a JSON object. So let's take a look at the red underline here. So the user ID is not being given a type. So we can fix this by navigating over to this first statement and defining a type for our user ID query parameter. And we can do this in TypeScript by specifying it as such. And then we'll see another red squiggly under the user ID variable that we're defining here. And to fix this, we simply just have to make sure that the query object is being set to a data type of any. So given that we're explicitly defining it as an any data type, now there won't be any issues when we retrieve the user ID parameter from the query object. Similarly, in the second line here, we want to make sure that we give a data type to the number variable by giving it a data type of number. Now, this is implicitly understood by the compiler since we know the data type of the return value of the function. So given that we know that the function returns a number, for sure the num variable has to be a number. All right, one more thing we need to do before we get this thing running is we actually need to change this last statement back to CommonJS format. And the reason for this is because our app.js, which is importing this, is a CommonJS file. So therefore, we actually need to use the old syntax of module.exports equal to router here. All right, and now if I navigate over to localhost 3000 and I enter a query parameter of user ID is equal to 5, it will successfully go through my code, go through the function, multiply by 5, return it, and then print it out as a JSON object here. Now, one last thing to showcase before we end off here is I'm actually going to convert this function into an asynchronous function. And I can do this by simply adding the async modifier. I'm going to have the results be returned via a result promise. And I'm going to change the data type into one of the predefined data types that TypeScript provides for us, promises. And that is promise that will return a number. And then we need to call await here and make sure that the function is given the asynchronous keyword. And once we save here, you'll see that it's dynamically restarted. And then we can go ahead back over to localhost 3000. And if we were to refresh the page here, you'll see that it'll be working just as expected. So there you go. That's a brief look at what TypeScript can do when integrated with your Express project. So overall, TypeScript really provides a lot of advantages for JavaScript developers. Thanks for watching.